All right, everyone, welcome, welcome. If you don't mind, please stand with me so we can do the Pledge of Allegiance. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, very good. Kathy, if you could do a roll call for us.
Absolutely. No City Council, Renee Saban. Present. Jim Petrakos.
Present.
Christina Bergbauer. Present. J.R. Galogli.
Here.
Jason Vandermeer. Absent. Darren Diskin.
Here.
Joanne Bartleson.
Here.
And Catherine Preda.
Here.
Quorum present.
All right, very good. Look, everyone, I appreciate you coming out tonight. It's kind of a special meeting that we have tonight that's really about bringing the Planning and Zoning Commission, Heritage and Architecture Commission, and the City Council all together so that we can kind of have a little bit of a training seminar. We've brought some folks in from outside, from TESCA, to help us everyone understand roles. I know we have new people on council, new people on our commissions, and I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of give everybody a brush up instead of just kind of learning from the other commissioners about what you're supposed to be doing, just to kind of get a nice refresher. And I thought it'd be a good thing, and I appreciate Ben getting this set up. Before we do that, though, and get into it, I do have just one order of business that we want to do while we're here, because we're not going to have our July 3rd meeting, and that is this. We have a motion to approve the designation of the city attorney if the city, as the administrator, if the city administrator is not available, and then the finance director to take over as the administrator if the city attorney is not available. So we're just trying to get a chain of command on who the would be the administrator. So I'll read it officially. So what I'm looking for is a motion to approve the designation of the city attorney, and if the city attorney is not available, the finance director as the city administrator pro tem, effective immediately until so amended by the mayor with the advice and consent of the city council. So Joanne made a motion. Seconded by Alderman Petrakos. Does anybody have any questions or concerns about it, or is it pretty straightforward? All good? All right. So just looking for a yay. Anybody yay? Yay. Any nays? All right, we're all good. So, got that taken care of? Thanks. All right. Appreciate this is kind of a casual. GR wins the Ultimate Casual Shirt Award for this evening. Yes. Jim wins the award of I can't get out of a suit and tie no matter what happens. Yes. All right. I know your mom would wag your finger at you, so you. All right. So we'll get on with this. So right now we'll just need a roll call, Kathy, for our Planning and Zoning Commission and for our Heritage and Architecture Commission, so we know who's here.
Okay, you got it. Chairman Bill Maloney.
Here.
Ken Shepard.
Here.
Scott Likens.
Here.
Will Pinn.
Here.
Dave Oxley.
Here.
Jim Belota.
Here.
And Brent Porfilio.
Here.
Quorum present.
All right, plenty of water up here if you guys need it. Don't hesitate to get up. Why don't you come on up from our TESCA people? Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you did them.
All right, for Heritage and Architecture, Jack Pastor.
Here.
Tom Pinn.
Here.
Scott Likens.
Here.
Christina Bergbauer. Here. Tom Alves. Absent. Dale Stillwell. Absent. And Mark Regas.
Here.
Quorum present.
All right, sounds good. So we won't keep you here all night. We'll let TESCA come on up here, introduce themselves, and we'll get started. So come on up. Welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate it. Good evening. My name is Mike Hoffman with TESCA Associates. I am a planner and landscape architect. I've been with TESCA now for 27 years, vice president with the firm. I have been to lots and lots and lots of planning commissions and city council meetings and historic preservation commission meetings and lots of other things over the years, and do 2 or 3 per week. And so they asked me to come out and do some training. I said, sure, be happy to. My main office is over in Plainfield, so I'm right down the street essentially. So pretty convenient. And really what I want to do tonight is have this be a pretty casual session. I'll go over some quick goals with you, if you will, but the little bullet up there, ask questions anytime. This is going to be informal. I've got a bunch of slides and stuff I'm going to go through. If there's not questions, interrupt me, but I'm hoping there's interruptions and we can address specifically your concerns and issues as we kind of go through this. But I'll hit a couple highlights of some goals, talk a little bit about the history of planning. That's a real short snippet, but I think it's important for background to understand why and how we are allowed to regulate development in the state of Illinois. Talk a little specifically about roles and responsibilities of the different boards and commissions and how that works. Then talk about procedures at meetings, good kind of summary of that, and good chance for you guys to ask some questions after you've experienced some things that maybe didn't work so well or did work so well, and want to talk about that, we can certainly do that. And then if you got additional questions at the end, we can certainly cover that. Thinking an hour and a half or so, we don't want to go too long, but our overall goal here is to kind of talk about some best practices and managing the development review process. We want to make sure that we're meeting the community's vision. We want to make sure that we are implementing your strategic plan. I put a quote for your strategic plan up here, which I thought was but it talks about to review city processes and procedures for efficiencies and effectiveness throughout the organization and improve communication within the departments for proficiency. What we're doing tonight, right? Further, to demonstrate Lockport's pro-business attitude. And a lot of that, honestly, is how people are treated in meetings and how you handle the review process. And so I think that, again, is right on point to what we're trying to do tonight. So wanted to kind of highlight overall goals for you tonight of what we're trying to achieve. And so let's talk about the history of planning nationally, but also in the state of Illinois. A lot of it actually started here in Illinois with a guy named Daniel Burnham. Probably most of you, maybe most of you have heard of him, I'm not entirely sure. But one of his famous quotes, "Make no little plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high, and hope and work." Daniel Burnham was kind of the author of the overall plan for Chicago back in the early 1900s. And it set forth the pattern to create Graham Park and all of the waterfront parks that you've got there in Lakeshore Drive and all those boulevards that they've got in Chicago. So he did have grand visions that were expensive to do perhaps, but created a great legacy for their community. And I think as planners and visionaries for Lockport, you want to be doing some of those same things. And so kind of wanted to start with that. He actually was kind of the principal public works director for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which did a couple things. It created this white city vision for what cities should be like. It was kind of this fresh look at what we should be doing when we create cities, rather than allowing cities to kind of reign and cobble together individual projects. Created a bigger picture and looked at the overall vision of what a city should be, and created what was called the City Beautiful movement. That's kind of a planning term that is used to talk about a process where we do create overall community plans and do create an overall vision and then define projects that kind of fit into that overall vision. From there, the first planning board was created in 1907. City planning continued to evolve. There was a first national planning conference. Burnham created his plan for Chicago in 1909. First zoning laws were passed in New York City back in 1916. At that time, they were really focusing on real life and safety issues. There were tenements and those kind of things, and lack of air and lack of water in some situations. So the zoning laws are really designed originally to promote public health and safety. Still are today, but we've gone a little farther than that today. There were a number of cases that have come out related to land use, always are. In fact, the Supreme Court just had a couple this week that were actually relevant to things that are going on in the planning world. But an important one was Amber Realty versus Euclid, Ohio in 1926. That created kind of the basis of what communities use for zoning. So you might hear the term Euclidean zoning. It's basically creating a hierarchy of zoning where you've got, starting typically at say single family being your lowest density, lowest intense use to heavy industry, and a range of different uses in between there is kind of the Euclidean zoning concept. There's some more modern zoning concepts that kind of mix uses and look at form and those kind of things. We can talk about that if you like, but that was kind of the start of some of the main zoning activity. In 1926, we came out with some federal standard zoning enabling legislation that actually is still in a lot of the codes that you see today. So that was kind of the basis of some of that. In the state of Illinois, state statute does define do in terms of zoning regulations, and it does talk about communities creating comprehensive plans. Now, some states have much better and clearer legislation about what should be in a comprehensive plan and how they should be structured and focused on smart growth and planning. Illinois statute is pretty weak, honestly, in that regard. And in terms of zoning, it's not the strongest out there either. So what ends up happening is a lot of zoning regulations and planning regulations get based upon court cases and how the courts have viewed planning and zoning decisions. So it's kind of a combination of looking at what's in state statute and case law. If anybody is really interested in this, Illinois Municipal League puts out a zoning handbook that is really a good document. It both summarizes what's in state statute and a lot of the case law that's out there. Pam's probably got a copy of it. You can just ask her, I suspect. But it is a good tool that I look at every once in a while when some issue comes up and I need to verify what state law says and what court cases say and that kind of thing. And so it's a real good publication. It only costs $20 or something like that. And I would guess they update it about every 5 years, and it was last printed in 2012, so it's probably going to have a new edition before too long. So anyway, that's my short history of planning and how we kind of get to be able to do what we do in terms of reviewing developments and creating overall visions for communities. So let's start talking a little bit about roles and responsibilities. Three key players in the development process as I see it. One, the city, and that's what the main role we're going to be talking about tonight, whether it's the city council's role or the planning commission's role or heritage and architecture, staff, consultants, kind of all that kind of review role, setting overall vision and creating the picture of what you want your community to be like. Certainly your residents are actively involved in that, not only from electing the city council and the mayor, but also in terms of coming out and stating their opinion on different development projects, particularly things that are close to their home or maybe in a key area of the community that there is a lot of interest and concern on it. And then you certainly have the developers, and that would include the tenants in particular project. If it's a commercial center, you might have key tenants that are have major involvement in the development process. Certainly you have the architects and engineers. Sometimes you have attorneys. Actually, a lot of times you have attorneys in Illinois. I practiced in my first 5 years in Texas, and we never saw attorneys at planning meetings, but we do here, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I guess, if you've got a good one. But anyway, so that's kind of the key areas and responsibilities. So city council, obviously, the city council is kind of the boss, but they're elected by the people, so you know they kind of relate to each other. But city council has a lot of roles and responsibilities. Looking at zoning cases and land use is one of them, and a very important one, but obviously they're looking at everything from taking care of the streets to personnel to a wide range of non-land use issues as well. Certainly should be setting some broad public policy. I know you guys have done some strategic planning in the last couple of years to focus a little bit on that. Certainly the final authority in a lot of things. And they appoint the members of the Plan Commission and Historic Preservation, so they have a very active and key role in this process. But their role is not to do all the fact-finding. You know, the Planning Commission's role is to have those public hearings, to hear the voice of the community. City Council shouldn't be rehearing things that went on at the Planning Commission. They should be able to take their input, digest it, evaluate it on their own, and make decisions without having to rehear the whole case and that kind of thing. So there are some clear distinctions in that regard. But in terms of the evidence and the information that they're looking at, it is pretty similar between what the commission is and the city council is looking at. So this graphic kind of looks at how a couple of those pieces fit together. By state statute and in your code, one of the key roles of the commission is to develop an overall community plan. So you have a comprehensive plan. Your comprehensive plan itself is a little bit older, but you've done special area plans for downtown and along the 355 corridor that are essentially a part of that comprehensive plan that are much more current and very relevant to manage growth and development. And those are really great tools to have, and make sure you have those in place and make sure you understand those because you should be reviewing any project that comes before you in light of what that comprehensive plan says. You want to see how that individual project fits into the bigger picture of what your vision of the community is. Plan Commission certainly is in a position to advise elected officials on policy and development applications and provide essentially your opinion of how it fits the rules that you've established in your development code, as well as the overall vision of the community in your comprehensive plan, as well as just kind of how you see the project fitting in the scope of Lockport and is it a good fit for this community. Certainly your role is to conduct the public hearings, to do that kind of fact-finding, to collect the information from the residents, to ask good questions of the developer, make sure that you understand and they're providing you the information you need to review a project, and then to obviously provide some advice and recommendation to the City Council. As I understand it, here in Lockport, if it's a variance, the Planning and Zoning Commission is the final say on that particular type of item. Some communities do continue to pass that on to City Council. I think wisely here you've not done that. It makes sense to have the Planning and Zoning Commission review variances and make a determination on those. It takes one less thing off the City Council's plate, which I think is a good move. Staff and consultants are certainly here to provide advice and recommendations for you on projects. That should be independent, non-biased kind of advice, and I believe that it is. I've actually worked with Pam, and Pam actually used to work for me at Teska Associates at one point in time, so I know you've got a good planner on staff, so that's a big plus. Certainly their role is to kind of provide you the information and make sure that all the key issues in the process are addressed as the applicant comes through, and make sure that they've submitted all the information to you that is necessary in a project. City Council and Plan Commission both should be active participants in looking at, does this project fit the regulations, whether it be the subdivision regulations or the development standards that you have in the code. Both, in my mind, should be kind of keepers of the community vision. I used to just say Plan Commission, but really it's the bigger picture of City Council and Commission that's important. And really both are a forum for discussion matters of important development issues to the community. So I think sessions like this are great, and I think you should do them on a regular basis, honestly. Not every month, obviously, but at least once a year. Get the commissions together and just talk about joint issues that are going on in the community. Y'all live in this community, and you want to make sure that your commission and your historic commission and the City Council are moving in the same direction. And if you don't have chances to have a dialogue and discussion like this, you might get off track a little bit. So I think this is a good forum, and the next one, do it round tables and just have a couple key development areas or something you want to talk about and have a dialogue and discussion on those. But that conversation, I think, is really important. It is we talked about earlier, one of your goals is to be development friendly. The easiest way not to be development friendly is not to be on the same page, because developers will go, I've seen this happen many times, go to the Plan Commission, get one piece of direction, maybe go to Historic Commission if it involves that, get a different direction, and go to City Council and get a third direction. That doesn't go well in the development community when they get tossed around. Time is money in that business, right? So they want clear direction and move, and even if the answer is no, at least they know that that's going to be consistent. What is really bad is when you get the commission and the City Council not on the same page, and what will end up happening in the development world is that word will get out, and they'll essentially ignore what the Planning and Zoning Commission says, because they know that City Council is going to make up their mind independently of what the Planning and Zoning Commission says. Shouldn't be that way, but it happens in some cases. So I've done a lot of work, and for a while that was clearly the case. They were kind of ignoring the Planning and Zoning Commission and just waiting to get to the City Council. So staying on the same page is a good thing. So I would encourage you to schedule, at least annually, a joint meeting like this where you talk about issues and concerns in the community. So, things to consider when you're doing development review. These are kind of general, and they certainly apply to both the City Council and the Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as historic preservation a little bit, although you've got some slightly different criteria, I'm sure, in terms of meeting National Register standards and those kind of things. But property values, the impact of a development does have an impact on surrounding property values. No doubt about it. It is important, and you should consider that in the development review process. How is that project going to impact the quality of life of the overall community and the surrounding neighborhood? That is a very legitimate and appropriate consideration in reviewing projects. The character of the community, I think, is really an important characteristic. You can have a new development, a new appropriate land use in a commercial development that makes sense for the community, but that development's going to be out there for the next 30, 40, 50 years. If they don't pay some attention to design and character and how it fits into the fabric of Lockport, you might end up regretting that and approving a project like that. I've worked in a lot of communities that for a while were just hungry for any type of development. And it didn't, you know, if it fit the zoning, the use category, they would approve it. They didn't look at the site design, they didn't look at the character of the construction and those kind of things. And later they came back and said, Mike, you were right, we should have had a little bit stronger in that regard. And I know you do, but it is, that character of the community is an important consideration in reviewing projects. Certainly how that project fits on the land, the environment, what's happening in terms of stormwater, what's happening in terms of preserving trees on the site, what's happening in terms of fitting into the natural environment and context of the project certainly are important development review considerations. Transportation, you know, it's rare these days that you go to a major development review project and don't hear from the transportation traffic engineers looking at parking issues, looking at impact on the roadway and those kind of things. But I would encourage you to think about transportation a little bit broader these days. Think about how it fits into your bike trail system, how it fits into sidewalks, how it fits into public transportation and those kind of things as well. Those are all relevant considerations in reviewing a project, and so those are very important. And lastly, but certainly not least, economic development. You want to have jobs in this community, you want to have a strong tax base, you want to have a diversified tax base that doesn't just rely on residential property taxes, but has commercial development and those taxes that come from that. And so those are all important pieces of looking at and reviewing developments. Any questions so far? Okay. I'll keep rolling. So some general rules of engagement, I'll call them. That, you know, when you're hearing a case and going through it, what are some things you should be thinking about and keeping in kind of in the back of your mind? First one is just to be positive. Now you guys, everyone in this room is kind of the face of the community when somebody comes in to do a development in this community. And chances are pretty good, if they came in and proposed something, they probably want to be here. And hopefully you want them here. Now, there may be some cases where you don't want them here, and that's true. But in either case, be positive with things and you know, try to look at it from the perspective of, you know, they've chosen to be here. We hopefully want them here. So ask, you know, positive questions. Certainly ask questions and be specific, but do it in a friendly manner, I guess, is the point with that. Make sure that you are remembering that, you know, they have chosen to spend their money to potentially come to Lockport, and whether it's a good project or a bad project for the community, you obviously need to decide. But always keep in mind that how you treat that applicant, even if you turn them down, is going to have an impact on the next project coming in, right? The developers all do talk to each other, the tenants all do talk to each other, and honestly, most developers I know are okay with getting a no, as long as you don't take 8 months to give them a no. You know, if you can move through a process that is fairly quick and streamlined, and you ask good questions, if they hear a no, they're okay. They'll just move on to the next project. But if you string them along and hold out and keep asking for additional information, and then turn them down, that's when you start creating that negative image. Or if the questioning is hostile. When I first started doing some work in Plainfield, we had a city councilman that was just, well, he's not here anymore, so I'll just say he was obnoxious. I mean, he would just like treat those developers like they were the enemy and like they were trying to ruin his community. And he just beating him up over everything, and that word got out, and for a while there wasn't any commercial development happening in Plainfield because, and you know, I understood why. They've got a better attitude now, but nonetheless, being positive is really important. Be prepared. You know, it sounds like you shouldn't have to say this, but I used to chair the Plan Commission in Mount Prospect, and I could absolutely tell you which of the commissioners read their packet and which ones had not read their packet. And you know, I know it's hard to read packets and get through all that stuff, but it is important to do. And absolutely, number one on my list, I put it in bold here, visit the property. I can't tell you how many times every new planner that comes into the office, they start reviewing projects. I said, did you go look at the site yet? No. Get out there and look at it, because there's always something. Every time I've gone to look at a piece of property, I'll find something out there that doesn't show up well on the map. Maybe it's a tree, maybe it's a sidewalk, maybe there's overhead utility lines that are running through there that it's going to affect the landscape plan. Maybe there's a lot more slope than it looked like. It gives you the context of the properties that are around it. I mean, there's a lot of great tools out there right now. You've got Street View and all the Google tools and all that kind of stuff that kind of give you a clue. But it's just not the same as just going and looking at the individual piece of property. So get out and take a look at the sites. That's kind of my #1 rule. And then understand your comprehensive planning and zoning regulations and just kind of how those things fit. Because it really is important. The developers are looking at your regulations and your tools, and they're judging whether their project fits by that. You guys need to be doing the same thing. You can't just say, well, I like it or I don't like it. I guess you can, but you're going to get in trouble if you do that. You might get challenged in court or turned down in the future. So you really need to understand your guidance that you've created in your comprehensive plan and your guidance that you've created in your development ordinance, and kind of stick to those guidelines as to how you evaluate a project. Be an active participant in the development process. Certainly listen attentively, but absolutely ask questions in a polite way. But ask questions so that you really understand what's going on. A lot of situations I've run into, it's interesting. Some are really good at explaining the project and presenting it well. Some just say, here it is. What do you think? Ask those questions. Make sure that you understand how it's fitting into those things we talked about before, how it's going to affect the overall economy of the community, how it's going to affect property values in the area, how it's going to affect and fit into the character of your community. Ask those questions to make sure that you understand how that's going to work and fit together. Again, how it relates to your comprehensive plan. And absolutely talk to each other. You have to be, careful with Open Meetings Act things and those, which I understand everybody's probably been trained at, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But absolutely, if your fellow commissioner on the other side of the room asks a question, you've got a follow-up question, ask it. Or if you think they've got an area of particular expertise, ask them in the open, obviously. But we can learn from each other, so we want to take full advantage of that. Yes.
I'd like to add something to the third line, understanding comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
Within our municipal code and within our development code, we have definitions. And there's 3 definitions that kind of are lost to people. And those definitions are concept plan, preliminary plan, and final plan. Invariably what happens when somebody presents a concept plan, what happens is people want the final plan. They want traffic, they want engineering. What happens is our staff will say, that's not part of this, or the presenter will say, that because that isn't part of this process. And the frustration that the developers have is palpable, because we don't understand what a concept plan is, or a preliminary plan, or a final plan. In my opinion, that is our major fault in the past 6 or 7 years that I've been observing things here in this. Okay, so
Yeah.
I recommend that everybody read our municipal code, the responsibilities of the planning commission, heritage and architecture, city council. It's imperative. Definitions, understand what the definitions are. So when people start asking specifics that the final plan insult the developers by asking for these things when they can't provide you the information, but that's not part of a concept.
Great point.
It's imperative.
Can you go through those 3?
Sure. I mean, so, I don't know your code as well as you guys do, obviously, but in general, when you have a concept plan process, it is designed to be just that, all right, to provide a concept and the overall vision of what somebody wants to do on a piece of property, and to see if it fits the picture of your community before they spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on detailed engineering and detailed architectural plans and all the detail that you will have to have before when you're ready to do a final project. But sometimes they have a different idea or a new idea, particularly in plan developments, of how things are going to work and how they're going to fit, and they want to make sure that it fits the vision of your community. So it's a very appropriate step and a very appropriate process, and can be very beneficial to both the developer and the community to have that initial view of, does this fit the character of the community? So that's kind of the concept stage, and that, you're absolutely right. You're not going to spend the money to do detailed traffic studies and to do detailed engineering at the concept level, because you don't know for sure whether the community is going to be supportive of it or not. Once the community says, okay, we think this is a good concept, we think it fits Lockport, then they're going to do their preliminary engineering work, and at that point they probably will do a traffic study and understand exactly how it's going to work, come back to you and review that with you and show you how that fits into the community. And then the final plan, essentially the final plan, you know, in terms of a plat, at least, and those kind of things, is just kind of a final confirmation of things, if you will. If they come in with a final plat that's a preliminary plat, they don't know exactly when they're going to kick the trigger and build the project and that kind of stuff. Final, they come in when they know, yeah, we've got the financing in place, we're going to build this thing, and after a final system with the preliminary, you should by default approve it. Is that pretty close to your process, Pam? Okay. All right. Yeah.
In the planning commission, some of the concept plan are basically saying, this is what we have in mind when we plan.
Mm-hmm.
And we accept it that way, this is what we have in mind. We hold a public hearing, and the public wants to know how many trucks, which of the times, how many hours,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what are the property taxes going to be, okay, way beyond that, and we tell them what you just said.
Yeah.
They go feds, and then the report is all put in the press and purpose because we put planting to the public.
That is the rub of the job. There's no doubt about it. It's like, it's not, yeah, it's like you can't, every time a project comes up in a community, it's likely that the people that it's going to affect are not familiar with the process, and you have to re-educate them every time. That's just the nature of it. They've never paid any attention to any of the stuff in the past because it never affected them directly. So it is a matter of saying, look, it's the concept stage. How many times you've heard it, like, oh my gosh, I tried to ram this through in the middle. It's a concept plan, right? And so it's just what it is. So part of the job is having to take those loans.
Certainly is, and certainly there's, you know, every meeting is somewhat of an educational process, right? Because you're going to have a different audience probably every night when you've got a controversial issue. So, absolutely, you know, one thing you can do up front, if somebody should explain just that. This is a concept plan review. It is designed to allow the developer to give us a preview of what they're trying to do to see if it fits the overall community. We're not going to get into a ton of details. Maybe you can head off some of those questions. It won't head off all of them. Yeah, I'll guarantee you people will continue to ask some of those questions that you just mentioned. But if you can do some of that education up front, that sometimes is helpful. Another thing that I've seen communities do, well, we'll get running hearings in a minute, so I'll hold off on that. But it's a common problem. But I think understanding that, first of all, at all of your level, but then communicating that up front in meetings can be helpful. It's, yeah.
I think the one big issue that everyone faces is that you make the concept plan and approve. Most people that come with a concept plan, they pretty much know it's probably going to be controversial or something big or this or we had one where it was zoned something else, like or planned for something, a comprehensive plan. They were looking for something else. Once you give that conceptual plan, right, the approval for that period is, well, we already gave it to them. Now, if you say no in preliminary engineering, they're going to shoot something else, but we already gave them that go ahead. So I think a lot of people have it around, like, let's ask a lot more questions now, we can figure it out. Because if you don't have a traffic study and you're proposing something, I don't know if you're going to have 3 trucks or 300 trucks. You know, and that, it's the top part of the game, but, you know, a lot of that stuff needs to, I think, in a lot of people's minds, figure out before you kind of give that first go. Because we don't want anybody spending money, and we don't want anybody hanging on every word that we said, right? The planning
Yeah, and I think it's important to communicate to the developer at that concept plan point your potential concerns, you know, to say, well, we think it's okay, but we certainly are going to be looking very closely at the traffic study for impact on this intersection or the truck traffic or that kind of thing. Or conceptually, we think it's well, but you're going to have to really treat the site well to preserve this grove of trees, or what direction you want to give them, but give them some clear direction. Don't just say, you know, blanket. Okay, you know, give them direction to highlight those things that you think will be concerns in the community. I think that's helpful too. Good. Appreciate those comments and additions. Other pieces of the city's role in the development project. Absolutely vote based upon the testimony that you hear and the standards that you hear and have in your code and regulation, and understand what can be required as conditions. You know, a lot of the projects you're going to do will probably be special uses or planned developments. You can attach conditions to those projects to say specifically what you want to see, and go a little bit beyond what the code specifically says in terms of the process, to make sure that that project is fitting into the character and context of Lockport. You can't put conditions on a straight zoning. So if a guy wants to come in and rezone a piece of property commercial, it's consistent with your comprehensive plan, he's going to get the right to do anything your code allows in that commercial district. You can't condition that kind of thing. But if it's a special use, if it's a variance, if it's a planned development, you can attach conditions to those things, and I would encourage you to think about doing that if it's necessary. If it's a unique site or if there's some characteristic that's a little bit different, that's your chance to kind of attach something to that recommendation. So even if you're doing a concept review, I think you could attach some conditions that say, here's the things we want to make sure we're going to look at when you come back in with your preliminary plan. So that's one way to address that.
Can you go over what examples of what conditions you would put in concept versus preliminary?
Yeah, I mean, the preliminary, you're going to have all the details, and so you can get a lot more specific. A concept, you can't get super specific, but you can say, you know, that at the concept level, conditions might be things like, you know, if it's a mixed-use project, we don't want any less than 60% of the development commercial or something. So, you know, looking at the mix of uses that you have on the site, you might put conditions on there that say we really want to see this grove of trees preserved, or you know, 75% of them, or something like that. You might, you know, if there's certain buffering issues that might be necessary in a piece of property, say you've got a industrial facility going next to a residential project development. You might want to put a condition that a significant buffer be provided between those different land uses. I wouldn't get into the details. On the preliminary level, you can probably get into some more details and say that we want a berm that's 6 feet high and planted with evergreen trees on top or whatever, and be specific at the preliminary level. Conceptual level, you just want to say we want a buffer between those two different land uses. So that kind of thing. Those are some examples. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask you this. If something goes
Mm-hmm.
and then it gets to preliminary, and preliminary at that point, it's like there's just not satisfactory answers to the kind of offering that they can provide, is it appropriate to say, yes, this isn't going to work?
Yes.
Or is it because, well, it's kind of the concept, you know, you're kind of
No.
on track.
Concept is concept. It means that if they come back with a project that is consistent with that overall vision, and they meet all the details of your code and of the requirements and the conditions you put on it, then yes, you should approve it. That's why one of the reasons why I'm saying add some conditions to that concept, because then it gives you some criteria to evaluate it as it comes through. If they come in, they did a concept, and you said, okay, that sounds conceptually okay, then you see the details of it, and you learn that it's going to cause major traffic congestion at this intersection, or it's going to, you know, cause flooding problems on the adjacent property, or there's just not a sufficient buffer between this use and that use. In my opinion, you absolutely can deny it, as long as you have good. But you need to have good reasons at that point. You can't just like it. You got to give them specific reasons why. But I think you can turn it down.
So what I'm hearing, though, is important for all of us to understand the difference between concept and preliminary.
Absolutely.
It's like, listen, don't get bogged some general things, but if you end up getting bogged down in hyper details and concept, you're kind of doing the process a disservice, because it's really meant to, that's where these guys are gonna spend the money, is in the preliminary
It is.
stage.
Right, right. And now the flip side of what I just said, if you've approved the preliminary, you really have to approve the final, as long as it's consistent with that preliminary. That one's not you can't change your mind after you've approved the preliminary.
Yeah.
But after the concept, if there's some good reasons for it, and particularly if you've put out conditions to address, then I think you can turn it down.
I'd like to add one more thing to that. A lot of thoughts. You know, the developers come, they go to Pam, they go to staff. Here are our requirements. And then there could be a PUD process, or could be development code, whatever it is. And they meet the requirements of the code, of our code. And then they get their snot kicked out when they're up at the podium, because people want to go ahead and put things that aren't in the code into requirements. I find that very frustrating when that happens. And so do they.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we have code, we have municipal code, we have development code. Once again, people need to read it next Friday. So you know what the heck we're doing. Quite honestly, I don't think we know what we're doing with this process, because it's just so disjointed. And so when somebody says, okay, I have met the code for this, and then we add on, then it gets to the point of, why would anybody want to come to Lockport? They get beat up.
I think one of the things he's alluded to is, and this goes back to something you said earlier, Mike, is at concept, we're getting so specific where we are locking into truck bay count and types of building. We're drilling down pretty deep at the conceptual level, so when we get the preliminary, the developers are feeling like, whoa, wait, you already agreed to all this. You can't change now, I just spent $40,000, doing this. And so that's where we push back and forth a little bit as staff, and we're kind of say, hey, once they get to some point, they've got their concept approval, we're saying we really shouldn't change that much. Maybe we somehow, I don't know how we find that balance where we try to slow our process down to concept, so we have more decision ability at the preliminary. Because the way it's kind of feels like now, and staff has an internal joke, by the way, I'm going to leak it, we have 3 council meetings, okay? You go to planning and zoning, you go to committee of the whole, and you go to city council. It's the same 3 meetings. I mean, the development slammed with full questions and reviews at all 3 processes. And I just felt like, I don't know how to stop that.
Yeah, so.
It comes down to the same thing that Phil brought up, the concept. And the concept, is it something that we in Lockport code
Sure.
On the specific bullet item, you look at a concept plan, sometimes the traffic studies could be the killer, where we knew that up front, we wouldn't have to spend the time and the money on the preliminary plan. On other things besides that, and go too far. It's a balance.
Yeah, but, well, so, I mean, obviously I've been doing this for 27 years. Pam's been doing it for a few too. We have, without doing a traffic study, we have a pretty good conception of what the traffic issues are going to be like without doing a traffic study. So,
And what the builder does too.
yeah, he does too.
At that
Absolutely.
point, he does too.
You know.
The problem is that it's, I think it's kind of hush-hush until the next step occurs.
Yeah.
And that's why it's frustrating that we have to start at a certain point with just a few questions for that particular concept. Everybody knows what that concept is going to be. Why not put it together, because then it answers a lot of questions
Right.
that we have when they first come for the,
And,
concept plan.
yeah, I think Pam's point was right on, and that you shouldn't take every project through the concept process, right? It's only projects, and you said, if it's different than what the comp plan says, then I think, yeah, you probably do need to go through that step. If it's generally consistent with the comprehensive plan, I would say no, just go straight to preliminary and forget that.
See, and I find also when it goes to different departments is that there's a lot of emotions that get
Sure.
in there too, and that's where the problem comes to, because a lot of these projects may be our neighbors, and so then we get a little personal, and we get a little bit more involved, and then we don't have the blinders on anymore, and it becomes more personal, and I think maybe we need to all, like you said, we have to put blinders and take one at a time, but the builders already know what's going to,
Yeah.
be okay or not.
Yeah.
We got a concept plan about the cold, the plan 6 or 7 years ago, for the massive cold storage plant. This concept plan included the variances of the height, the setback, drainage, just about everything imaginable. Every time we questioned why you needed all these variances, you reminded us of the property tax that was going to be, he was going to pay. We voted it down, that was the end of it, they built it in Lennox. We're advisory to the city council, because we advised unanimously against the environment taken to the city council. We're just
Sometimes the right thing is just say no, you know? Absolutely.
If I can throw in 2 statements, one part of what we've been doing also is, what Joanne said, there's been information from the mayor's our economic development, and our community development essentially, right? We're working through these, so developers are coming and talking about it, they're talking about general issues, and it's working its way, and when it comes to planning commission, they're not privy to what was discussed and dealt with, right, or the decisions that were made. When it comes to the city council, like, what did we know, right? So I believe these are the we tabled the concept plan, so we just didn't have enough information to vote on it one way or the other. That next month, we'll have more
In
information.
Bill, the retrospect, as Mike said, they said, here's their plan. That was the end of it. I mean, we're like, that's all you got. No, they didn't have it. But it was warehouse again. And we're back to the warehouses. And then the only thing we have on 151st Street is opening up everyone's eyes to, we're gonna make sure this is done right.
Well, I think we had some other options. It wasn't, it's a piece of property that's not currently, it's not annexed into the city. There's less, the property rights there are far less than they are with a person who owns a piece of property that's currently zoned industrial. So it's a lot easier for us to say, yeah, we're not ready to move forward on that. We'd like to see how they build out, how they affect the city. So it's easier for us to do that on annexed property. I agree with what happened there on that process. Good, we're able to take our time on that. I guess as I'm listening to this, I find the one thing that's really interesting is, especially at concept, this has happened in a couple of projects now, where we drill down way too deep, and I think as the Planning and Zoning Commission with the concept plan, it's the ability to say, look, these are the 4 issues that you're going to face, and we're going to have real information for when you come back with preliminary. And even if they know it, that's fine, but we're going to need to see it with traffic studies, with density, with berming, with if it requires all these things. It's like I'm not asking you for the height and width of a berm right now, but understand that's going to be a huge part of this preliminary plan.
Yeah.
So instead of us getting all bogged down on it, at that point, allowing it to go through the process. Now, I know part of what we struggle with here as commissioners and council folks is like, man, people want answers now, right? And so it's like, okay, I'll find out how big the worm's going to be. I'll find out. It's like, so we end up getting swept up in, kind of the emotion of it, especially if it's a contentious project. Because like we said, usually you don't have a concept plan unless it's going to be contentious. So we end up getting swept up into it and not just taking the leadership role saying, community, I know that, those who live next to us are upset, but this is the process, right? And we are getting the main concerns through the concept plan so that we can then expect these answers, these specific answers at preliminary. That's where we really are able to make those judgments and stuff like that. Succumbing to the idea that we have to have all these answers now at concept. And it's a tough thing to do, but if I'm hearing this right, that is the proper and appropriate process.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If it comes with all those conditions, then when it gets to preliminary, if they've already met those conditions, they're like, hey.
I have a 15.5-foot berm, just like you said.
You gave these conditions for approval and I met them, now why are you?
Yeah, so you got to be careful. My suggestion would be careful with the conditions. So, yes, you're going to say that we want a good buffer and, perhaps a berm in this area, but don't get specific to say 15 feet and trees spaced every 25 feet or whatever.
Right.
Don't get that specific. If you get that specific, then absolutely, the developer should expect you to approve it.
And I'll tell you another reason why it's important not to get bogged down. Just listening to this, I can see it. It's like, when you do, look, let's be honest how this plays out. Project comes, everybody goes bananas who lives next to it, right? And then you get all this pressure, and over the course of the next month, it goes through this, maybe 2 months, depending on when this last project, we had to do a couple meetings, we just got so contentious. And then we've got these hyper-specific details in the concept plan that now when it comes back in preliminary, we find ourselves in those lots. Whereas if we didn't do that, you allow us, as commissioners, citizens, and everyone else, to have a little breathing room, right? Okay, this went through a concept plan. Now we digested it for 2-3 months. As they go out and they do preliminaries and they come back, it gives everyone the opportunity to fully digest everything, as opposed to like, man, we gotta get answers now, people are screaming. And it's like it does everybody a disservice, even our decision-making process. So it's important for us to be, show the leadership in these meetings and say, listen, everyone, this is how
And,
I understand both sides very well. But every deal's different. I think you just have this blanket, hey, I couldn't stand up there and tell a room of 80 people to say, I'm gonna vote yes because the stiffs are gonna come out later. You know, well, but it's hard to do.
That's the leadership part, bro. Look, I know you don't like to hear this, folks, and you're some of you are my neighbors, but it's like a concept plan is a concept plan. These are the areas of concern that's gonna have to be addressed at the preliminary. I can't get this entire project completely wrapped up tonight. This is not, this is the way it works. No one's gonna come in here with all the details over the next course of a couple of weeks. We say, it's fine, I have some deep concerns, it's okay to say all that stuff, it's appropriate, and these are the areas that are gonna have to be addressed before moving forward. And again, it gives everybody then the opportunity to digest it as opposed to, because, you know, every project has somebody who calls me and they, I don't care what it is, I'll get donuts. Right, doesn't matter what it is, man. I can bring Jesus here for a healing clinic, I can have people yelling at me. Okay? So every project gets people who are in. So it does, it's a matter of like, okay, you have to deal with it and explain, even if you have to do it over and over again, because every time it happens, it's a new group of folks who are upset. That's just the process. And we can't get all the details at this point. Because then we end up having that mess we have. And I think now we find ourselves in a highly detailed concept plan going into preliminary.
Well, I mean, I've been doing this for 2 years. It seems like everything that's brought to us is always rush, rush, rush. And the guy says, well, I need to know now because I want to have, you know, I got to tell my potential guy who's going to occupy it. He wants to know today. So, and it seems like, so now it looks like we want to make, because the city go, whoa, let's just slow it all down and let's do it right. How are you going to tell the same developer who's dying, I got to know now?
Yeah.
I mean, you're going against what the rush is.
Yeah, and I get, and that's another, and it is a struggle. That goes back to, you know, one of your points you got back later about how do you be pro-business, pro-friendly, and it's because everybody says that. I need answers, and we saw this with the haunted house. Oh my gosh, if we don't get this built, if we don't get this through, where it's not going to happen, the investor's going to walk. And then they couldn't finish it, and it took another year for them to open. So it is. Everybody gives you the line of like, oh my gosh, we have to have answers today. So that's
Don't just stand back by that. I'm comfortable with that. Say, let's get the correct answers at a slower pace, and let's force ourselves into making decisions that we're not ready to make.
But here's the hard part. Here's the hard part, right? Is when you know, J.C. Penney's wants to come in, right? Everybody wants it, and I'm like, sorry guys, we got to slow boat this, and then we're gonna lose them, right? It's like any deal in the world. It's like, oh boy, how do we play this out, right? So that's always the struggle. It's easy to slow boat it when it's due here, and I want $2 million, right? Hey man, you're not any value. Write me that check. So we slow boated that because it's no skin off my nose that they didn't come, right? So that's the struggle always with this stuff.
I think Mike had a great idea, everyone agrees that those 4 items, whatever we're talking about, for a concept plan, that's on the agenda, clearly describes so the residents see it also. Concept plan A is a review of the bullet items. That sets the tone, it sets the table for when you guys are out there doing that, you can reiterate it verbally again there and say, this concept plan, this is what we're doing. There's a lot of times residents come here like, what meaning is concept plan, positive or
sure. They have no idea. I think that they think you're just proving the project completely, right?
We
Yeah.
go to the warehouse and I explained all the,
Yeah.
the with me and they're like, they just voted yes. I'm like, it's just concept. Hold on. So they get mad and then it kind of gets worked out. So setting, I think, that tone on the agenda and reading it in community, I think will help.
Yes, and it'll be important for the leadership, whether it's
Yep.
Dave is doing, taking the chair for the season now, and or whether it's, you know, who's ever sitting in the big seat or whatever, it's important for.
And even for us, the city council.
That's what I'm saying, yeah, or me or whoever in the future.
Got to set the stage. Absolutely. Pam, you had something else?
Something real quick, just, I like the slower concept, slow down a little bit, so you can start sales, so you can take something away from someone more, so it may make it a little harder to get
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, sometimes the pace is controlled a little bit too by how much they've done their homework and how thorough they are, right? If they don't have their act together, you absolutely should say, no, go back and think that through and give us the information we need to make a good decision. There's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely. And as you're mentioning, Pam, you know, after you've done this for a while, I can't tell you, almost every single project you'll hear, we got to get this thing approved now. And life tells you, not really. You know, they wouldn't be coming to you to begin with if they didn't have interest in this community. They've already identified this as a site that makes sense for them. Yes, treat them well. Yes, treat them consistently. Yes, treat them politely. But you have to approve it the first time they show it to you. No, you need to make sure that it works for your community. So.
And what we have done, just so you know, Mike, is in our review process, when I first got here, applicants would submit 1 month before the plan commission, and it would go to the plan commission with the school condition. And now that, we did that for about 2 years. And then finally, we had conversations in our last strategic session, where I said, what I'd really like to do is extend that process out by another 4 weeks, so that we can do a couple reviews and a couple back and forth, so that when it does get to the plan commission, there are just some really outstanding issues. And then what we also did is we used to go right to the committee of the whole that following week. So if plan commission on Tuesday, that project would go to the committee of the whole that following week. Well, again, there was no time for any back and forth, and then the project would be conditions and the budget conditions and the ordinance, and they couldn't figure out what was what. So we then extended that out and said, you go to plan commission in July, you're going to first see the committee of the whole in August. So it gives an opportunity to clean it up even more. So we have extended the process of it, but again, you still get people that complain.
Oh, you will. No doubt.
About why they gotta wait 2 months to do this, and we can expedite some things, and I mean, not that they're over either kind of thing, but for the most part, the back and forth, I mean, you have to admit, has been a positive thing, because not any of these outstanding issues.
Yep, makes sense.
Right, that's the, it's been streamlining a lot of the things we do.
Okay, I'm going to keep rolling, but obviously this was a good dialogue, and now I think you all have highlighted the issue of concept plan. Probably should pull out the definitions, make sure it makes sense. And honestly, if it's not working, maybe you need to tweak the definition, or maybe you need to change the process. I've worked in some communities where they do concept review, but they do it as a joint meeting between the different commissions and the city council, and they hear the case without providing a clear recommendation. Now, if I'm a developer, I don't like that, because I want some direction from the community, right? But they're worried that they're going to, you know, overly, and even if you don't provide a specific recommendation, the developer's going to have a pretty good sense of where the community is going just by the conversation. So that is an option. I don't highly recommend it, but some communities don't actually vote on concept plans, so it is possible to do that too. Okay, a couple other things. We talked about, you know, being patient and civil and respectful, obviously. Bylaws and meeting procedures. This is something that I've seen more and more communities do, and honestly, I don't know if you guys do this or not, but either on the back of your agenda or a separate brochure or something, you should have something that explains just simply to the public how your meetings are run and operated. People don't come to city council or plan commission meetings all the time. They don't know how the procedures work, and they don't know how the process works. They don't know what a concept plan is. Something to educate them and tell them as they're coming into the room, I think, is a really good idea. I was doing some work in Dubuque, Iowa, and actually before each of their city council meetings, they play a short 2-minute video with the mayor just kind of describing how the meeting runs and works and the different sections of the agenda, and they've got a consent agenda and those kind of things. Just explain to the public what it's like and what's going to be happening at that meeting. And that helps tremendously just in terms of letting the public know what's happening. Because you know, the first time you go to a plan commission meeting or a city council meeting or historic preservation, you don't know what to expect. And so that educational piece really is important. So I would encourage you to do that and have some clear procedures for those kind of things. Put your phone away. Obviously, it sounds obvious and stupid and like you should do that. The reason I threw that on there was actually a case down in Champaign about a year ago or so, where some commissioners were, had their phones out, and they were able to FOIA every text that was sent during that meeting. Now, it might have been just a note to your husband or your wife to say, I'm going to be late for this meeting, but it's FOIAble if you pull out your phone in a public meeting. So be careful. I mean, there's good reasons to do it sometimes. I mean, I sit on the development review committee down in Morris, and I'll use my phone just to pull up an air photograph to look at the area. So there's a good reason to do it, but be real careful with that, because it is, in a public meeting, something that is FOIAble, and you know. So just be cognizant of that, I guess, is the point with that. Or laptops or anything else, okay? Other things about roles in the development review process. You know, stay informed in terms of local planning and development issues. There's a couple of Supreme Court cases this month that are really relevant to planning issues. There was a case up in Wisconsin. It was heard by the Supreme Court. Talked about they had a person had like 3 lots on a lake, and they were combined at one point in time. They wanted to build additional houses on it, but there's all kinds of environmental reasons why it didn't make sense. So the city, that the city or township, whatever it was up there, came in with some rules and regulations environmentally that says, no, you can't do 3, but you can still build 1 additional one. They viewed, right, the Supreme Court said, no, there was good, clear environmental reasons. There were up front, and so it was okay. So that, you know, those kind of things happen on a regular basis, and staying in tune with that, and I'm sure staff and your attorneys will keep you aware of those things. But the keeping abreast of that stuff is good and appropriate. You know, staying current on planning tools, I'll give you some suggestions later on how to do that, but those are all important. I already mentioned this one, but do keep in mind, you know, this thing's going to be around. Whatever gets built is going to be around for a long time, right? So that, be cognizant of that, and do have a clear vision for the future. Areas change and evolve, and they should change and evolve. The roles of our downtowns have changed dramatically over the last 15, 20, 30 years, right? And the functions of that have changed. Be cognizant of that. Just because an area is developed in a certain way today may not always be appropriate. There are older areas of towns all across the region that, you know, historically were industrial. A lot of riverfronts were always developed industrial, right? Because there was access to the water and everything else. Today, that doesn't necessarily make sense. You want industrial areas out in business parks and those kind of things. So the point is that you should have a vision for the future. You should, you know, perhaps do some updated, keep your downtown plan current, your 355 corridor plan. Maybe there's some additional corridors where you want to take a little bit closer look and examine what makes sense in those areas now, and have a long-term vision for those things, because ultimately that may not be, what's out there today may not be the best use of that land in the future of the community. So think and then be visionary. You know, I'm kind of imploring you to do that. Now, you've got a lot of documents that look at your city's vision. You guys have been doing some good strategic planning lately. That addresses a lot of planning issues that are relevant, and also addresses a lot of other issues that the city needs to deal with. Certainly, you've got your development codes, your comprehensive plan, your 355 corridor, your Lockport downtown plan. All great tools, all need to be kind of viewed as a whole, really, and should be coordinated. But the last one, that little image of everybody sitting around the table, that was my point earlier on, and I think the conversation tonight has been good on the issue of the concept plan. You should be having similar conversations on a regular basis between everyone in this room, on a regular basis, to look at different areas of town or different issues that may be coming up in the future. So this is a good start. Keep it up, but keep that vision and thinking, forward thinking, beyond just that one development case that you've got to review that night in the back of your mind. Yeah. Absolutely. Good. Yeah.
Quick question, this came up with the last plan commission meeting. Comprehensive plan is per rule of thumb on when amendments should be made to it. We got a discussion on marketability of different zones in the city, and how office is almost a dinosaur now. I don't know if it's ever going to come to Lockport. There's such an industrial demand right now. We were discussing the 355 plan, I think, at the time. A lot of the office areas, you know, they're going to become manufacturing
these things should be updated every 5 to 8 years. Our comprehensive plan is like 1992. So, I didn't read the first page. You know, remember I got it. Yeah. We all got a jive, but we all need to be updated, coordinated.
Yeah.
So on that last slide here,
Yeah.
downtown master plan, that's like 2006 or 7.
Mhm.
Development code, that might be 1912. The only thing that's actually been updated is the strategic plan that we worked on last fall, and 1955 master plan. But the development code, comprehensive plan, and downtown master plan are all obsolete. Development code is, maybe more developers will come out if they see a better coordinated effort, more marketable land
Yep.
for what they want.
Absolutely. No, and you know, doing those plans, you should involve them a little bit in the process too, right? They're a wealth of information, and when they're not talking about a specific development project, they can be a good asset to you. To answer your question, how often should you update the comprehensive plan? My general rule of thumb is I think it makes sense for the Plan Commission to have on their agenda at least once a year just a general chat about those issues, to think about areas that are changed or things that are evolving and kind of look at it. I would suggest probably every 5 years for sure. You ought to reassess the plan, and you know, every 10 probably overhaul the whole thing, because the world changes pretty rapidly, right? So yeah, but at least every 5 years. But I would talk about it on your agenda at least once a year in terms of those pieces. Do you need to update the whole plan? If it's 1990 vintage, probably. But for the most part, I am comfortable with the idea of developing these specific sectors and looking at those in more detail, and those really are a part of that bigger comprehensive plan, and that's a good tool too.
Rubs with that, like the downtown master plan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we were to redo that, that would just be, I think, it would go over like a level. It's like we do that we've done that, we have 8 downtown master plans, and they always clicked up. And so it's like, oh, now we're gonna do another one. And I don't really necessarily think the downtown master plan is updated.
No.
It just needs to be moved forward. But that goes to a question I have.
Okay.
Because like, so there's a piece of property down by Lockport. It's owned industrial, because it's been industrial since it was done. But obviously our downtown master plan calls for a different type of downtown use. As you said, we try to move industrial away, which is where it's naturally, goes these days, and we try to make more, downtown urban, residential, retail, restaurant, entertainment along the canal. So, a user who's down there now wanted to purchase a lot and, park their tractor trailers. It's zoned for it, they're allowed to do it, so this idea that like, well, make sure it fits with the community, because you have to look at it for years. The ability to say no to property that's zoned for a specific use, at best we sat down and talked with these guys and said, hey, listen, this is what our master plan calls for, and we're trying to work out a deal with them now where that, like, if we get a developer that's willing to do the kind of developer we're looking for, that they would, they're open to the idea of selling it as opposed to. So we're trying to find ways to work with property owners and developers without like saying, hey, look, we're somehow, and I don't even think we have the power to hold property hostage and say, hey, I know it's own industrial, but it's not what we want, and we're gonna sit on this until.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, I apologize for interjecting, but if we want to keep away from anything that's pending or that may come before the city council, so maybe hypothetical.
All right, all that's hypothetical. If I have somebody who wants to use a specific piece of property for that is industrial, like in our downtown master plan, and I say, no, man, we're holding out for that unicorn farm, right? It's like, how do you do that to the property owner and to, you know what I mean? They have property.
Yeah.
So I'm asking you that question. How have you seen that?
If it's zoned, well, if it's something that you really think is inappropriate in that area, you want to proactively rezone it so that they can't continue to do that.
Because that's a question that comes up frequently.
Yeah.
A neighbor doesn't like what's going to happen. Oh, why don't you guys rezone it? How do you rezone somebody's property? If your neighbor doesn't like your house because they want to park where your house is, well, enough people don't like your house, Mike. I'm going to rezone You have to go. I mean, what rights does a council in the country have to rezone somebody else's property?
Well, that's why, I mean, so if we'll make sure, obviously, down, and it's because of the market conditions in this area, because of the character of this area, changing that zoning from industrial to downtown business or whatever the right district is, you can proactively go out and rezone that piece of property as a city and be the applicant. It doesn't have to be the property owner that does it. The city could rezone it. Are you open to possible challenges? Yes, but if you've backed it up by doing your homework, doing your comprehensive plan, having good reasons for doing it, the courts would typically support you on that, I think. So, I mean, you've got to have a good reason, you've got to have a plan and follow some consistent logic, but if you do that, it's defensible. Okay, roles. So, put this as commission chair. You know, certainly some of this stuff would apply to the mayor too. But you know, making sure that you know you just have a good environment and environment in the meetings. Certainly, we talked earlier about educating the community up front about what you're doing and what you're particularly reviewing and what you can and can't do. That is really important, I think. Certainly making sure that the comments are not random like they are tonight, but they are directed to the chairman. I think is really important, and make sure that people understand that that's how it works. Certainly, if you've got questions, ask staff, ask your corporate counsel during the meeting. You know, ensure that everyone that's interested in the project does have input. Make sure, you know, there should be a pause when you say, anybody have any final questions or comments, and make sure that you give them a chance to actually put their comments in. Sometimes people are hesitant. You want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard in the meeting. Certainly stick to the agenda and the topic. I know when I was chairman of the Plan Commission of Mount Prospect, and you'd get into a public meeting and you had a crowd, the audience doesn't know what criteria we have to evaluate by. And so often they would get sidetracked on something that we really don't have the latitude to discuss. So they got, it was a residential case, and they got into the price point of the home. We really didn't have the authority to govern that. We could govern the density, we could govern the lot size and those kind of things. We couldn't really get into the price point. It wasn't in planned development or anything. It wasn't. So, you know, I had to, as a chairman, let them know that. And they didn't like that answer, but I had to give them that answer, that was out of our purview to review. So that is really important to keep that educational element and stick to the topic. Otherwise, you could be in meetings that last for multiple meetings if you don't stick to what you're actually able to review and discuss in the project. So keep the discussion focused. We'll talk about voting in a minute, but you know, just manage and operate. Don't let things get out of control. Say up front, you know, we're not going to allow applause after each person that states comments and that kind of thing. And you know, you can have time limits on people's discussions. If it's a crowd, obviously you don't need time limits necessarily, but if you got a big, I would suggest, you know, saying that each person has 5 minutes or so to comment. And you might also want to separate just comments from questions. And it's also absolutely highly important, I think, essential to say up front, look, if you just agree with the last person that spoke, don't repeat everything that they just said. You know, we want to hear all the voices, we want to hear all the comments. We do not need to hear the same comment 30 times in the meeting. You can make that comment too. And so those are all important elements of running a meeting.
What about responses? People are saying something, keep all our responses to the end?
Yeah, typically that's one reason, a good reason to separate comments from questions, because people might get up and talk for 5 minutes but not actually ask a question that doesn't need a response. If they do have a specific question, I think, you know, let them get through their conversation, and then from an efficiency standpoint, I think it typically works better if you kind of get all the questions out and then let the developer respond to all those kind of at one time rather than each individual item, or break it into categories. So if he has an expert that's dealing with transportation and traffic stuff, just address those questions at that time. If he's got a landscape architect, and there's that separately, but don't answer. If you do open Q&A continuously, you're going to be there forever. So I figure out an appropriate way to segment it, I think. Other key players, self-explanatory stuff, I think, for the most part, but, you know, staff's here to provide overall technical guidance to you, certainly to make sure all the legal stuff is appropriately in terms of notices and those kind of requirements, and to be fair and consistent. The petitioner should be giving you complete information. I like Pam's comment earlier. You know, it may sound like it's taking a bit longer, but it really is not taking any longer because you're getting complete information as opposed to just partial information. And then, you know, once you've got all the information you need to review a case, you can do it much quicker and much more efficiently. So make sure that you've got those tools in place. Certainly the petitioner has the right to should answer your questions about the proposal, and they should also have the right to ask questions. So if a resident comes out and they are making claims that it's going to destroy their property values, it's okay for the developer to say, okay, do you have any evidence of that? You know, and those kind of things. So those are appropriate things.
Next question would be,
yeah.
What is our legal responsibility when people make environmental concerns? Like, is there a study that says diesel smoke is doing this or diesel emissions are doing this? I mean, what do we believe, what do we not believe, or what do we have to believe, or as long as there's no one saying this actually is a cause, what are our concerns?
Yeah. Obviously, it depends on, so an example, there is some things that are controlled specifically by legislation. So I just got done dealing with a cell tower case over in Olympia Fields. And, you know, federal legislation through the FCC says we can't regulate or get into discussions of the radio waves that come off of that tower. The FCC has said that's a non-issue, it's not life-threatening. People don't believe it necessarily in the public meeting, but FCC says we can't consider that in our recommendation. So we need to tell them that up front. You'll still get people arguing with you, but you really can't consider that because the FCC says you can't. Other topics, you know, it kind of depends on what it is, and you've got to use your best judgment and rely on staff to help you guide you through some of those things too. I think that's my main suggestion there. You know, I like the idea of setting ground rules for the public up front in the meeting or having a brochure at the back that describes how that goes, because if you don't, meetings can get out of hand in a hurry. A couple quick things on hearing procedures. You will have some cases that are public hearings. You'll have some cases before you that are just public meetings. What's the difference? The notification provisions is essentially the difference. If it's a public hearing and state statute says it, you have to publish in the newspaper. Your code actually has other requirements for putting notices, sign on the property and sending notifications within so many feet and those kind of things. Those are required by your ordinances, by state statute. A public meeting, so like a final subdivision plat, say, that doesn't require a public hearing. You don't have to notice everybody around there. You don't have to put it in the paper. You just have a discussion. Discussion is probably typically fairly similar, but it doesn't have to be involved if it's not a public hearing, I guess, is a simple way to put that. We've talked about meeting control already. I've got another slide on case presentation. I'm going to skip over that. We've talked about the attitudes and discussions. Again, I started to talk a little bit about the questions versus opinions. In cases that are going to be lengthy, I've seen commission chairmen saying, first, you know, let's just ask questions. If you have a specific question, come up and ask that question, and we'll deal with those things, and then you can come back and state your opinion on the case. That sometimes helps the flow on major cases, so that's a possibility. This one's important, I think. You know, it's a Latin word, right? Ex parte communication, but basically this is conversation outside the realm of the meeting. Developer calls you at home or at work and says, you know, I'd like to talk to you about my project. Don't have that conversation. It needs to be in a public meeting like this. Or if a developer comes in and he hasn't even proposed something to the city and he asks your opinion, be really careful with how you respond to that. I mean, if it's something that you absolutely think is perfect and great, okay, tell them that. But remember, it's going to have to go through a process and an approval process, and you don't want your hands too early. It may sound like a good project based on what he told you, but he didn't necessarily tell you everything about that project. So when it comes to the Plan Commission, something else may come out about it, and you don't want to tie the city's hands and say, well, I talked to Alderman Smith, and he said this is a great project. Well, you don't want to tie the hands of the commission or tie the hands of the council to something before you've got the complete picture, right? So be careful at tipping your hand too early, I guess, in the process. Make sure that and the process is set up these public meetings and public hearings so that everybody is hearing the same thing and the same comments and can make a fair and honest. So again, just be really careful with doing things outside of the meeting realm, I guess, is the main point there. A couple of other, yeah.
Did you recently have something like that? I guess if anybody does get contacted, or talk to them, or let that know so you can follow it.
Yeah, I'd say in some cases there is good need to have small meetings like that. I did a project over in Western Springs, and it was a big. We were working for the city, but the developer wanted to meet with all the aldermen and discuss it, privately to give them kind of a preview of stuff. They set up a formal process where staff was there. They met in groups of 2, so they didn't avoid the Open Meetings Act, and it was consistent throughout each group. And with staff present, it was okay because they could make sure that things weren't getting out of hand and things were handled professionally and appropriately. So there is a way to do it, but you just got to be really careful with that.
I think that's just a matter of preference from the elected officials to us. I mean, yeah, I work in places where you do it both ways. Sometimes they come in 2 by 2 and you want to get a better, understanding of it before it's publicly presented. In other communities, they don't want that. They just work with staff and then present it to us, and we'll look at it holistically together. We just need, Pam and I just got to need feedback from the body. That's what
Absolutely.
I got a phone call once from a petitioner looking for a variance on his property, and he called me at home at my house. I referred him to staff. I filed it and discussed it with me.
That's exactly what you should do. That's perfect. Exactly right. I said earlier, go to the site and look at the property. Absolutely do that. But for the most part, do it independently, or in a couple cases, sometimes it may make sense to do it as a whole body, but then it needs to be published as a public meeting and be public. And that's okay. If everybody goes collectively and the developer wants to point out some things to you and as a group, that's okay. It can be helpful. But don't go in there and have the developer give you an individual tour or something. That's a no-no. Okay, you gotta do it publicly or just do it on your own. Couple things about taking testimony at meetings. I assume you guys do swear witnesses in collectively. Is that yes, no?
No.
No? Okay. Well, not at the council, but the Plan Commission. If it's a public hearing, you really should, even if you just do it in mass, ask people to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Just to put it on record that,
When we do planning.
Who's that applying to? Like, the petitioner's up there with a landscape architect, an engineer, or something. Everybody who's the petitioner is the petitioner.
Oh, the attorneys have got their own rules, but everybody else, it applies to the people providing testimony from the developer side, and it applies to your residents. They can't come in and say, whatever. That's not true. They need to be talking.
I think that's only for if you're a fact-finding body.
Well.
So it's.
Okay.
I mean, we should do it on our Planning and Zoning Commission, but I think when you are actually voting on what's on the record before the Planning and Zoning Commission, it's not necessary. I mean, but we can discuss it and see if we want to do that, to be cautious.
So I think it's very important to have someone come up with a comment that we have their name and address, because I've seen over the years, we've got people who live a mile away and they're testifying about this in my backyard. Well, it's not in your backyard, or it's in my subdivision,
Yeah. And if there's any appeal through the court, they have to notify and actually name all recorded person of record. So their name and address for if they are objecting at a hearing.
Absolutely, yeah. When anybody comes up, they should give their name and probably their address, or at least to make sure they signed in their address when they came into the meeting. Absolutely.
That brings up that very important question, because wasn't there a state or federal statute just updated a couple of years ago where you can't demand that they go ahead and give their address? There's a case in Ohio just recently.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, we probably have, you can ask again.
I can say, if you'd like, please tell us your address.
Yeah. Yeah.
And planning commission would go ahead and tell us that, state your name and address for the record, please. And if they do, fine, if not, refer to something.
Some of the questions about asking address, either at planning, zoning, or versus city council.
At the city council, if it's for just public comment, there's no, you can't require them to give their address to give a comment. There's a violation of the Open Meetings Act because they're able to come and comment. Now, if there's if it's a fact-finding body such as the Planning and Zoning Commission, the rule would be that they would have to give their name and address for the purpose of an appeal or any other, court case.
It's a two-way street. If the speaker declines to give me address, I can decline to give his remarks any consideration.
If that's the rule that the commission wants to do, if you're an objector and you want to, only have parties who give their name, but I'll take a look at it. But I think, I don't know if there's that could be prohibitive for them to object. To look at it.
Give us our address, I don't know if it lives 10 feet away or 10 miles away.
Yeah. Yeah, he has plenty. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've covered most of this on the slide already, so I'm not going to get into the details of that. But, I think this is important, right? You might show up one night and see that and say, oh, man, what are we what are we going to do here? Well, and obviously there's some life safety stuff, right? If it's too big a crowd, you got to move it to another location, that kind of stuff. But generally what I would suggest, one, ask if there's any attorneys representing the objectors. Okay, I think that's important because if there are, they can act as a spokesperson and you don't have to listen to that 400 or 500 people that are in the room, but let the attorneys deal with that. And that's particularly helpful when you need to have questions and those kind of things answered, and when the developer wants to ask questions of other people. So if there's attorneys available, I think you acknowledge them and get that up front, I think is really important. We talked earlier about separating comments from questions. I think with a large crowd, that makes sense. If it's a small group, I wouldn't worry about it. Not a big deal. Absolutely allow the petitioner to present their full case up front, okay? Don't interrupt it with questions. Let them present their full case up front, including all their experts before you're letting the objectors present their side of the story. The developer really has should be given the right to present their full case first. With the partial information, it may not look appropriate, but when they see the whole picture, hopefully some light bulbs go on. So those are some suggestions. Yeah, this is where you were talking, and it may not need to be under oath, but typically I have seen them under oath when these public hearings are going on, and do it that way. Mark exhibits, so again, you've got stuff documented if it does go to court later on. I think that's helpful. So keeping track of exhibits that are put out by the petitioner and sometimes by the public as well. Mark them and identify them so you've got a good, clear record of what your decisions were based upon. Use court reporters for hearings? I suppose if it's video, you're probably fine. Yeah.
If we chose to go down the path of requiring swearing in for the testimony, if they don't swear in, can there be a reason to deny testimony?
I believe you can. I mean, generally, we do this in the other, my previous employer's place, but yeah, we do swear in all the witnesses, anyone who's going to object, and they want their testimony to be heard and on the record. So when you say that, I think generally people tend to agree to do that, because then otherwise, you know, you kind of give that notion, unless you swear in, you're not going to come up and object for the record. So it will dissuade people from wanting to do that. So. You know, and again, for the city council, you know, and that's the comment, or whether they're actually testifying versus commenting. You know, people could comment like, I don't want this in my backyard. That's not a testimony. Testimony is, you know, this will bring undue hardship, it will lower my property value. You know, I talked to so-and-so, you know, who appraised my property, and they told me it was going to be X, but after this, you know, development or rezoning is going to be B. So, or, you know, D minus or something like that. So in that case, you know, you do need them to, they're testifying versus, I don't want this in my backyard.
Absolutely, good points. Okay, a couple other things. Motions, I don't know how you guys make motions, but in my recommendation always is to make the motion in the affirmative. Even if you don't like the project and you're going to vote no against it, make the motion in the affirmative, because if you don't do that, it gets confusing when you go to the vote. So, you know, I'm perfectly fine with you to approve the project. No, you're going to vote against it, but that's fine, as long as you have some consistency with that and make sure that the motion is stated in a positive manner. I think that's the best way to do it, really. Linking to standards. I'm going to have some slides on this in a second, but it really is important to kind of follow the rules that you set up. Follow the rules that are in your code and use that code book to help you guide your decisions. And we'll talk about that in findings of fact in a second. I think we'll skip over that just to keep moving. So findings of fact. I don't know how well you guys have been doing this in the past, but your code book does clearly say that you should be making your decisions based on certain criteria. So if it's a special use, you've got criteria in your code that you're supposed to evaluate that case by. If it's a variance, you've got criteria in your code that you should be evaluating that case by. You really need to be doing that. I've been in some communities where they have lengthy conversations on all 8 bullet points. I think that's a little going too far with it, but I think it is important to review those things. I looked at a couple of staff reports, and you guys do sometimes put those in your staff reports. That's sufficient to me. I don't think you need to rehash everything. Now, if you disagree with something that they put in the staff report on the findings, you should talk about that. But otherwise, it really is important to make sure that you're using those consistent rules and regulations for everybody to be consistent as you're developing and reviewing projects going for the community. And there really kind of is some evidence going forward. So these are your standards for special uses. I'm not going to go through all of those, obviously, but they are in their code book. You should be looking at that and thinking about all of those criteria every time you review a case for a special use. You have clear criteria in your code for variation, same thing. You should review those every time you are talking about a variance to make sure that there is a clear reason to give somebody a variance. It's not just because they're your neighbor and they're your friend and they presented a nice case. It's, you know, is there a particular hardship? Is there a particular difference in this property than other properties in town? A lot of cases when I've reviewed them for variances, I've said, well, yeah, okay, I see that, but it probably applies to other property. In that case, you should probably be modifying your code rather than just giving a variance for that particular situation. So those things are out there and you should be aware of them. But certainly make sure you're looking at those standards as you review cases. Now, your code doesn't have specific standards for reviewing a change in zoning. Most codes don't, obviously. That one has kind of been governed more by case law. There's 2 cases that are out there. Sonny could probably tell you way more than I could about these, but they're typically called the LaSalle case and the Sinclair case. They define specific criteria that communities should look at when you're reviewing a zoning case. And it's the stuff that you would think, right? What's the surrounding property like? What did we say in our comprehensive plan? How do those things fit together? But really, think about those things as you're going through and looking at a zoning case, because they really are important I'm sure if you don't have a copy of this, you probably should. It's in this book, but they are really good guidelines to look at. Again, for sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but they are the standards that the court's going to look at. If the court's going to look at them, you should be looking at them before the court looks at them, right? Because you don't want to be in court. You want to avoid that. And so you understand how they're going to look at cases and use criteria when you're evaluating a case to whether it's appropriate to rezone a piece of property or not. Voting, I already said put the things in an affirmative. Just procedural things, you probably got training on this already in Open Meetings Act or something else, but sometimes you get a petitioner that doesn't present a good case and is lacking information, and you think it should be tabled to a future meeting. Say why it should be tabled, and if somebody seconds it, no debate, just vote, table it or don't table it, right, and move on. If there's a table to vote in favor of something or not, or to table it or not, and nobody seconds it, it dies. I don't know if you have many workshops, but if you are just doing a separate workshop like tonight, we can't vote on anything tonight. You can't make any decisions tonight. We're just having a workshop to discuss issues. So even if you all agreed tonight that we should change your concept plan rules, we can't do it tonight. We can't vote on anything like that. We're just having a workshop. I don't know how you handle when people vote no on cases, but I've been in some communities, and I actually like this procedure, particularly at the Plan Commission or at the Historic Preservation Commission level. If it's a 4-3 vote in favor of something. If I'm a city council person, I'm interested in why those 3 people voted no. So I've often given them a chance to say, what did you vote no on that case? And if they don't want to state the reasons, that's fine. They don't have to, but sometimes that information is helpful to the city council when they go to make their decision. So you don't have to do that. It's an optional thing, but something you might want to consider if there is a significant negative side to a particular vote.
Are you saying that with the vote?
No, not make the vote, and then after the vote, the chairman would say, if anybody that objected to that or voted no to that case wants to state their reasons, feel free to do so. That kind of thing. After the vote. Okay, couple things on sources of additional information. Obviously, your staff is your first line of questioning and information, but there's some other good resources out there. American Planning Association is certainly a good organization. They've got a good website with lots of good information on it. Maybe a little bit, no, it looks pretty good on that screen. It's a little hard to read on this screen. But they put on some good conferences. The state conference is in Naperville this year, which is obviously pretty close by. They have some really good deals for Plan Commission members and separate training in those kind of sessions. And they really is kind of a nice way to stay informed about bigger picture planning issues and some of these case law things that we've talked about. So that is a resource to you. Illinois Municipal League, particularly for city council folks, I suspect that you go to those sessions, but great information in a lot of the sessions and a good way to get out and stay in tune to the things that are going on. So those are some of the best 2 available to you in the area. A couple of other things, if you have not availed yourself of it, these days with geographic information systems and those kind of tools, they are really great to do some homework prior to the meeting. So if you want to look at a site and how it fits into the context, you can go to the Will County GIS system or maybe even the city's system. I didn't really double check to see what you've got available online, but great tools to understand the property, the values of property in the area, what the land looks like, what surrounding zoning looks like, and a good chance to do your homework. So a good tool to take a look at. Certainly the Regional Planning Agency, they're actually in the process of updating the regional plan, and you fit into that region. So keep apprised of that. And then kind of another one that's pretty good out there is a site called Planet Zine that just has all kinds of articles and information about different planning topics. So if you're really interested in sign regulations, just go to Planet Zine and type in sign, and you'll get all kinds of information about that topic or whatever topic you are interested in. So with that, any other questions or comments you guys got, I'd be happy to answer them. Pam knows how to get a hold of me. If you still think of something after the meeting too, I'd be happy to respond to it then. But
I have a comment. Pam and I talked about it today. Sonny's probably aware about the Open Meetings Act training seminar. What we call it, Sonny?
Oh, it's the online training, all the new elected officials. Be certified, and it's only once. If you did it once, you don't have to do it again. But any new commissioner.
Heritage Architecture Planning Commission, City Council, and
Within 90 days to go online. I think Ben sent an email out. You don't fail, everyone passes. So that's how you get the certificate.
I think our registration for taking that, we find it work also.
Yes, it goes, you could either email it to Donna or print it out and bring it in. Yes, elected officials, any appointed commissioners, anyone who's appointed, so if it's your first time, within 90 days. Yeah.
A real quick question, I think one of the questions that we're talking about getting this strategic plan or this planning session going is scope and breadth of each of those commissions that are there. Can you talk to about, like, we're talking about a piece of property, we're talking about how it fits in the community, and there's other things that are affected, like development or the redoing of that road, development of the road in front. If that's part of the deal or not part of the deal, and the planning commission is voting on it or not, heritage and architecture or not. City council is voting on it, you know, like how are we talking about it? Some of those things happen in PUD, like you're discussing, you know, there's money that's here, some developments, you take money and put it for a traffic signal and a bunch of people contribute. What happens years down the road. Some you have to redo that road in front of you and all that. What are your thoughts on scope or reach of different departments?
Yeah, so one, I think it's important that everybody understand the roles in the process. But I also am very pro-transparency, I guess, in terms of, so like we talked about annexation agreements the other night. And yes, it is true that the city council holds the public hearing on the annexation agreement and approves it, and the planning commission really doesn't. But every annexation agreement I've ever seen has a zoning component to it, right? So there is a relationship there, and I think it is appropriate to share some of that information with the planning commission. Not that they're going to vote on the dollar amount of the fees and all that kind of stuff, but they should have some awareness of how the deal is being structured and at least where it's headed, because I think that is important to inform them. Yes, the commission needs to focus on the zoning and the specific issues that are under their purview, but understanding the bigger picture, I think, is important for them. And let's face it, a lot of times planning and zoning commission members or heritage commission members eventually become city council members, so it's a good educational piece for them to understand how that stuff fits together too. So, you know, absolutely keep the discussion at the meeting focused primarily on what your role is, but having that background information, particularly in a staff report or something, I think is important.
So items like, hey, there's a condition to this property that they should redo this road and put in another sidewalk and take it all the way down the street to the other corner. That's probably not in the reach, or do you think it is in the reach of that property of these commissions?
It's, yeah, you know, I think they're open. I've always been okay with commissions doing a couple different things. One, attaching specific conditions that is within their purview, but you know, extending the sidewalk down the street beyond that guy's property is out of their purview. They can suggest it if they want to in the meeting. I wouldn't even include it in the motion, but if you want to make a comment about that, you can make a comment about it. But you definitely stick to what's under your purview in the statute in terms of any kind of recommendation of formal action.
What's happened at the planning commission, and we referred to earlier, is that we're following codes. Planner saying, based on this code, this is fact. And then there's times when the code says, no, in our annexation agreement, we don't have to do that. Well, if we don't know that, we're wasting our time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That needs to be communicated, for sure. That's one of the downfalls of annexation agreements over time, is that stuff gets negotiated in and out of those things, and it's not consistent. Staff changes, and nobody really knows. And yeah, it can complicate things, for sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike, appreciate your time, some of your opinions. Looking now to, is any other questions, any other comments you guys got? Otherwise, we'll just make looking for a motion to adjourn tonight. Jim? Who's that? Christina? Oh, Catherine, sorry, I didn't hear. All in favor? Okay, all right, thanks, everyone.